The gavel struck the sound block with an authoritative crack, silencing the murmurs in the courtroom. Sunlight filtered through high windows, casting shadows on the faces of those in attendance. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension rooted not just in the case at hand, but in the unspoken societal dynamics that hung like an invisible fog. At the center of it all sat Judge Randall Whitmore, a man whose decades on the bench had solidified his reputation as stern but fair, or so he believed. With his crisp robe and commanding presence, he epitomized the traditional figure of authority, embodying the system's weight and privilege. To his left stood his clerk, shuffling papers, while attorneys whispered hurriedly, preparing their final arguments. Across the courtroom, seated with a quiet dignity, was Cassandra Monroe. Her presence was understated yet unmissable. Dressed in a simple yet elegant black suit, she sat with her spine straight, her hands resting calmly on the table in front of her. Her eyes held a steadiness that contrasted with the bustling energy around her. To the casual observer, she appeared to be just another litigant, someone seeking justice in a system where justice often seemed elusive. But Cassandra was far from ordinary. Her story was one of resilience forged in the crucible of adversity. A woman who had faced countless obstacles, both personal and systemic. She had learned to navigate spaces where she was often underestimated. And today, she was ready to challenge not just a legal argument, but the very assumptions that had been ingrained in the courtroom she now occupied. The case seemed straightforward on the surface, a property dispute involving a local community center. The judge had already made preliminary remarks, leaning heavily on precedent that appeared to favor the opposing party, a large development firm seeking to repurpose the land for commercial use. But Cassandra represented the community center, a space that had been a beacon of hope for marginalized groups in the area. What no one in the room yet realized was that this hearing would become far more than a legal battle. It would unravel as a story of quiet dominance, where the power dynamics of race, gender, and authority would be upended. Judge Whitmore, confident in his judgment and steeped in the traditions of his role, was about to face a reckoning he had never anticipated. This moment was not just about a courtroom or a case. It was a microcosm of larger societal forces, a clash of systemic privilege and the unyielding strength of those who refused to be silenced. The stakes were more than financial. They were deeply symbolic. As Cassandra glanced around the room, her gaze briefly met the judge's. There was no hostility in her expression, only a calm assurance that seemed to challenge everything the courtroom represented. And though the judge didn't yet know it, this encounter would leave him questioning the very foundations of his authority. The stage was set. What unfolded next would not only define the outcome of the case, but also shine a light on the quiet power of resilience and determination in the face of entrenched hierarchies. The courtroom buzz settled into an expectant hush as Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the legal briefs before him. His tone, measured but firm, carried the weight of authority as he began addressing the room. Ms. Monroe, while I appreciate your passion for this matter, the precedents here are quite clear. Community sentiment, while important, cannot override established property laws, he said, his words carefully chosen but laced with a subtle undertone of dismissal. Cassandra Monroe rose to her feet, her movements deliberate. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm and clear. Precedent does not exist in a vacuum. The law must also serve justice, and justice is not blind to the consequences of its application. Her words hung in the air, causing a ripple of murmurs among the spectators. Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow, the first sign of a slight annoyance. He was not used to being challenged so directly, especially not by someone he had unconsciously categorized as an underdog, a black woman standing against a well-funded corporation with a seasoned legal team. The tension in the room became almost tangible. It wasn't just about the case. It was about what Cassandra represented. For years, Judge Whitmore had prided himself on being impartial, yet he had rarely paused to examine the subtle biases that shaped his decisions. Today, those biases were being gently but unmistakably exposed. Cassandra continued, her tone unwavering. The community center is more than just a building. It's a lifeline for people who have been historically overlooked and underserved. To prioritize profit over people would be to erode the very purpose of the law, to protect and serve the public good. Her argument was logical, but what struck the room most was her delivery. There was no anger, no theatrics, just an unshakable confidence that made her words resonate. The opposing counsel, a sharp-suited attorney named Richard Vaughn, smirked as he prepared his rebuttal. "Your Honor," he began, "while Ms. Monroe's sentimentality is admirable, we are here to discuss facts, not feelings." The comment drew a few chuckles, but Cassandra remained unfazed. She met Vaughn's gaze briefly, then turned her attention back to the judge. Her calm demeanor made the contrast even more striking. Where Vaughn's arrogance was loud and performative, her confidence was quiet and resolute. Judge Whitmore nodded, gesturing for Vaughn to continue. Yet, as Vaughn spoke, detailing the corporation's plans and emphasizing the inevitability of progress, the judge found his attention drifting back to Cassandra. There was something about her presence that unsettled him, not in an aggressive way, but in a manner that forced him to reconsider his assumptions. For Cassandra, this was not just a courtroom battle, but a microcosm of her larger journey. She had faced systemic challenges all her life, being underestimated in academic settings, overlooked for opportunities, and dismissed in professional spaces. Yet, each instance had only sharpened her resolve. This particular case was deeply personal. The community center had been her refuge growing up, a place where she had found mentors, resources, and a sense of belonging. To see it reduced to a line item on a corporate agenda was not something she could accept. But it wasn't just the legal arguments she had to contend with. The courtroom itself was a space laden with unspoken hierarchies. The predominantly white legal team across the aisle exuded confidence, their privilege almost palpable. Even Judge Whitmore, despite his reputation for fairness, carried an implicit bias that shaped how he perceived Cassandra. For the judge, this case initially seemed routine. Yet, as Cassandra spoke, he began to feel the weight of his own assumptions. He had seen her as a passionate, but ultimately inexperienced advocate. Now, he was beginning to realize that she was far more than that. Her arguments were precise, her presence commanding, and her ability to articulate the intersection of law and justice was nothing short of remarkable. The room seemed to hold its breath as Cassandra concluded her opening remarks. "Your Honor, this is not merely a case about land. It is a case about what we, as a society, value. Do we prioritize profit at the expense of people's well-being? Or do we honor the role of spaces like the community center, which have served as pillars of resilience and hope?" For a moment, Judge Whitmore hesitated. It was subtle, but it was there, a flicker of doubt, a recognition that the path he had planned to take might not be as clear-cut as he had thought. The dynamics of the courtroom were shifting. What had started as a seemingly straightforward case was evolving into a confrontation of deeper societal issues. Cassandra's quiet dominance was not just in her words, but in her ability to make the judge, and everyone else in the room, see the case in a new light. The conflict was no longer just about property laws or legal precedents. It was about the intersection of race, power, and justice in a system that often failed to address them. And for the first time in his career, Judge Whitmore found himself questioning not just the case, but his own role in upholding that system. The courtroom's energy shifted as Cassandra Monroe stood again, this time to cross-examine a key witness. Her voice remained steady, her tone respectful, but the precision of her questions revealed an unshakable confidence. "Mr. Larkin," she began, addressing the lead architect for the development firm, "you've stated that this project will benefit the community by creating jobs and increasing property values. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's right," Larkin replied, his demeanor smug, as though rehearsing a line he had used many times before. "And yet," Cassandra continued, pacing slowly in front of the jury box, "your own reports project that less than 10% of the jobs will go to local residents. Is that also correct?" Larkin hesitated, his expression faltering. "Well, yes, but those numbers don't account for secondary economic benefits." "Thank you, Mr. Larkin." Cassandra interrupted him gently, but firmly, cutting off his attempt to recover. "And regarding property values, are you aware that many current residents of this community already struggle to afford rising rents?" Larkin's discomfort was palpable. He glanced at the opposing counsel, who shifted uneasily in his chair, but made no move to intervene. Cassandra's questions were methodical, each one peeling back another layer of the developer's claims until the carefully crafted narrative began to unravel. Her approach wasn't loud or confrontational. It was a masterclass in quiet authority, forcing the witness to reveal uncomfortable truths without a single raised voice. Judge Whitmore watched intently. He had seen countless attorneys cross-examine witnesses, but there was something different about Cassandra. Her ability to command attention without demanding it was unsettlingly effective. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning not just the facts of a case, but the fairness of the system itself. As the day's proceedings continued, Cassandra introduced a piece of evidence that shifted the courtroom's focus entirely: a letter from a local historian detailing the community center's origins. The letter, rich with personal anecdotes and historical significance, painted a vivid picture of what the center had meant to the neighborhood over decades. "Your Honor," Cassandra said, handing the document to the court clerk, "this letter demonstrates that the community center is not merely a structure. It's a cultural landmark. Displacing it would erase a vital part of this community's identity." Whitmore examined the letter carefully. The handwriting was neat but earnest, the words imbued with emotion that no legal argument could fully capture. For a moment, he looked up at Cassandra, who stood silently at her table. Her calm demeanor had not wavered once throughout the trial, but her quiet strength now carried an unmistakable weight. This was no longer just about the law. It was about humanity. The turning point came when Cassandra called her final witness, Mrs. Eleanor Baker, a 78-year-old woman who had been one of the community center's first patrons. Mrs. Baker's frail frame was deceptive. Her voice, though soft, carried the force of decades of lived experience. "I remember when I first walked through those doors," Mrs. Baker said, her hands clasped tightly on the stand. "It was 1964, and I didn't have a place to go after school. That center gave me a chance to learn, to grow, and to dream. It gave me hope." Her testimony was brief, but devastatingly effective. By the time she finished, the courtroom was silent. Even the opposing counsel seemed reluctant to cross-examine her, sensing that any attempt to undermine her would only make their case weaker. Judge Whitmore's face betrayed his inner conflict. The law, as he understood it, was clear. Yet, for the first time in his career, he began to see how the strict application of that law could perpetuate injustice. Cassandra's quiet dominance wasn't just in her arguments, but in her ability to reveal truths that transcended legal jargon. During a recess, Whitmore found himself pacing in his chambers. He thought about Cassandra's words, Mrs. Baker's testimony, and the community's plight. For years, he had prided himself on his impartiality, but now he realized that impartiality could sometimes serve as a shield for systemic inequities. When the court reconvened, the judge's demeanor was different. His usual air of authority was still present, but there was an undertone of humility that hadn't been there before. "Ms. Monroe," he said, addressing Cassandra directly, "your arguments have given this court much to consider. The law is meant to serve justice, and justice is not always as straightforward as we'd like it to be." Though his words were measured, there was a distinct redness creeping into his face. The judge, who had once viewed Cassandra as a determined but overmatched advocate, now saw her for what she truly was, a force of quiet power who had dismantled the very foundations of his assumptions. The courtroom's dynamics had shifted irreversibly. Cassandra hadn't just won over the jury or the spectators. She had changed the judge himself. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as Cassandra Monroe delivered her closing arguments. Her tone was calm, measured, yet every word carried the weight of unassailable conviction. "Your Honor," she began, her gaze steady and unwavering as she addressed Judge Whitmore, "this case is not merely about zoning laws or development plans. It is about the soul of a community, the preservation of a legacy that has uplifted generations. If we allow the erasure of this center, what message do we send to the people who call this neighborhood home? That their history, their lives, are negotiable." Her words hung in the air, resonating with a power that no objection could diminish. The jury leaned forward in their seats, captivated. Even the opposing counsel, who had been combative throughout the trial, now sat silently, his confidence visibly eroded. Judge Whitmore's expression was inscrutable, but his eyes betrayed an internal reckoning. The arguments had been compelling, the evidence thorough, but it was Cassandra's unyielding belief in her cause that had dismantled his preconceptions. As she concluded, Cassandra turned toward the jury. This case is about more than the law. It's about justice, the kind of justice that sees people, not just policies. I trust you to do what is right, not only for today, but for the generations to come. She returned to her seat, her posture as composed as ever. The room was silent except for the faint shuffle of papers as the court clerk prepared for the judge's instructions to the jury. Then came the unexpected shift. Before addressing the jury, Judge Whitmore cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice steady but carrying an unusual weight, "I must take a moment to acknowledge something." The courtroom froze, every eye fixed on the judge. "Ms. Monroe," he said, turning to Cassandra, "throughout this trial, your professionalism, dedication, and clarity have been exemplary. You've presented not just a legal argument, but a moral one that has reminded this court of its duty to serve justice in its fullest sense." His words were careful, deliberate, yet there was an undercurrent of humility that hadn't been there before. "In my years on this bench, I've prided myself on impartiality, but you've shown me how easy it is to overlook the deeper implications of what we consider impartial. For that, I thank you." The murmurs that swept through the courtroom were brief, but palpable. For a judge of Whitmore's stature, known for his rigidity and unflinching adherence to procedure, to openly acknowledge a shift in perspective was nothing short of remarkable. Cassandra inclined her head in acknowledgement, her expression remaining calm, though there was a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. The jury's decision came swiftly, in favor of the community. The center would remain untouched, its legacy preserved. As the verdict was read aloud, a ripple of emotion spread through the room. Some members of the gallery wiped away tears, while others clasped their hands together in silent celebration. Mrs. Baker, seated in the front row, smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude as she looked at Cassandra. The opposing counsel shook Cassandra's hand reluctantly, but respectfully, muttering something about a battle well fought. The transformation extended beyond the verdict. Judge Whitmore, who had begun the trial as an embodiment of the system's authority, now represented its capacity for growth. His acknowledgement of Cassandra's impact sent a powerful message. Even those in the highest positions of power are not immune to change. As the courtroom emptied, reporters clamored for interviews, their questions echoing in the corridor. Cassandra declined most of them, choosing instead to spend a quiet moment with Mrs. Baker and the other community members who had supported her. One reporter managed to ask her a question before she slipped away. "Ms. Monroe, how does it feel to have changed not just a case, but possibly the perspective of a judge?" Cassandra paused, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Change isn't about grandeur. It's about persistence. Quiet doesn't mean weak, and dominance doesn't mean loud. Today was about the power of truth and conviction, nothing more." Her words, like her actions throughout the trial, were simple yet profound. In the days that followed, the case became a focal point for broader discussions about equity and representation in the legal system. The courtroom victory was celebrated as a triumph of justice over bureaucracy, of quiet strength over entrenched power. For Judge Whitmore, the experience became a catalyst for change. He began attending workshops on implicit bias and mentoring young lawyers from underrepresented backgrounds. His rulings, while still firm, reflected a deeper consideration for the human impact of the law. As for Cassandra, the case was just one milestone in her career. She continued to advocate for communities like the one she had defended, her reputation growing as a lawyer who not only understood the law, but wielded it as a tool for transformative justice. The ripples of that courtroom victory extended far beyond its walls. It was a reminder that power is not always about who speaks the loudest, but about who speaks with purpose and integrity. The courtroom doors may have closed that day, but the story of Cassandra Monroe's quiet dominance and the transformation of Judge Whitmore echoed far beyond its walls. For Cassandra, the victory wasn't just about preserving a community center. It was a testament to the power of unwavering conviction. She became a symbol for countless individuals facing similar struggles. her story reminding them that change doesn't always require shouting or grand gestures. Sometimes, the strongest statements are made through quiet, resolute action. In the months that followed, Cassandra's work gained national attention. Legal forums, advocacy groups, and academic institutions began discussing the case, not just for its legal implications but for its broader social resonance. It became a case study on how systemic change begins, not with sweeping reforms, but with small, pivotal moments where individuals refuse to yield to injustice. The center Cassandra fought to protect flourished, becoming a hub for community growth and empowerment. Programs were expanded to offer free legal aid, financial literacy workshops, and mentorship initiatives, all inspired by Cassandra's journey. For the youth who walked through its doors, her story became a beacon, showing them that their voices, no matter how quiet, could still command attention and respect. Judge Whitmore's transformation was equally significant. His acknowledgement of Cassandra's impact had been a humbling moment, but it didn't end there. The experience compelled him to confront his own biases, both personal and systemic. He began engaging in dialogues about equity in the judiciary, attending workshops on implicit bias, and mentoring young lawyers from marginalized communities. Whitmore's rulings began to reflect a deeper understanding of justice, not just as a legal concept, but as a human one. His courtroom, once seen as an unyielding bastion of authority, became a place where voices like Cassandra's could be heard and valued. This transformation didn't go unnoticed. Whitmore's colleagues and peers began to see his courtroom as an example of how even the most entrenched institutions could evolve. Other judges and legal professionals started questioning their own practices, inspired by his willingness to change. On a societal level, the case ignited broader conversations about representation in the legal system. Cassandra's poise and eloquence highlighted the importance of diverse voices in spaces of power. Advocacy groups and think tanks began pushing for reforms, calling for greater inclusivity in the judiciary and legal education. For the communities watching from afar, Cassandra's story offered hope. It demonstrated that systemic change is possible, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Her quiet dominance became a rallying cry for those fighting for justice in their own ways, proving that power isn't always about volume. It's about purpose and resilience. Reflecting on the journey, Cassandra often emphasized that the victory wasn't hers alone. "Every step I take," she once said in an interview, "I walk with the people who came before me, the pioneers, the dreamers, and the fighters who made it possible for me to stand tall today. This isn't just my story. It's ours." The long-term impact of that moment in Whitmore's courtroom was profound. It wasn't just about a single verdict. It was about the ripples that verdict created. For every young lawyer who saw themselves in Cassandra, for every judge who reconsidered their approach to justice, and for every community that felt seen and valued, the story became a source of inspiration. As the years passed, Cassandra's work continued to evolve, but her core belief remained the same. Real change starts with quiet strength and steadfast resolve. Her story became a reminder that dominance isn't about overpowering others. It's about standing firm in your truth and letting that truth shine so brightly that it cannot be ignored. The lesson for the audience is clear. We all have the power to challenge injustice, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet strength of our convictions. Cassandra's story isn't just a celebration of one woman's resilience. It's a call to action for us all. Injustice doesn't crumble overnight. It falters in moments like these, when one person dares to stand firm, forcing even the staunchest systems to reckon with their flaws. It's a reminder that while the fight for equity is ongoing, every small victory builds the foundation for a better future. And so, as the credits roll on this story, the audience is left with a question. What quiet revolution will you start today?